Okay, I looked and found out this was the last slide we had on that particular example, so this is the last slide. These are just some of the considerations that may have to be entered into for trying to solve that problem of reducing congestion, etc. So, one of the things I do frequently is, as even today, is learn from you. Learn from things that you bring up or examples that you give. And it's things that sometimes, obviously, I use in the class. So this was something when this was first done 8 years ago that wasn't in the slides. And at one point in time, someone said, here's something that happened to me. And so we'll read the first slide and just look at this. The procurement person, the assignment was to buy something. And so they wrote specifications to buy this, said how much they wanted, and when it was supposed to be delivered and where it was supposed to be delivered. And they put it out, and they got a good price, a good vendor, and the vendor, as required, delivered what was required, by the time it was required, by the place it was required. And normally you would think everything would be fine, that all's right with the world when a vendor does exactly what you want them to do. Except in this situation, what the person who brought up this example said is, oh, guess what? We forgot one little detail in our specifications. And that detail was we didn't want everything at one time because we couldn't handle it at one time. What we actually wanted, but we just forgot to say in the specifications, was we wanted this spread out over a year, and we wanted 1/4 of this every 3 months because we had no place to store all the items that came in at one time. And you think, well, that is a kind of elementary thing. If you don't want it all at one time, you need to say that to the vendors. The first thing they did when all of a sudden at the loading dock, here comes, I don't know, 1,000 of something when they were expecting 250, was call the vendor and say, well, can we send 750 back? And the vendor's like, well, no. Because my price was predicated upon your specifications. Your specifications said 1,000 or whatever, delivered this time, this location. We went out, we got volume discounts. We calculated how much it's going to cost to ship that volume one time. We can't pay to get it back to us. We can't pay to store it. I'm sorry, but we did what your specifications said. And the vendor had, the agency had the situation of what do they do now, and I don't know whether they went out and rented space, whether they sent it out to somewhere else to store it, but all because they didn't specify what they wanted. And that's part of analyzing the problem. So they got what they wanted, but they really didn't want what they got. So, and what I'm going to ask you now is, well, these are the things I said. These are the things, the complications of why the vendor couldn't help them out. So, does anybody along the line, do any of you have any of these stories that you'd like to tell me of something that you thought you were doing something right and it turned out wrong because of either something you didn't anticipate that you would do differently the next time? And I'm not saying you will, I'm just asking whether anybody has a story you want to tell. Okay, good. No one has a bad story to tell. That's good. All right, we're going to start off with our first little exercise. And I think here we're going to do at least 6 groups. We have how many? 38, 37? All right, why don't we do 6 groups of 6 and with one of them being 7. And what I'd like you to do is, within your group, is take about 15 minutes or so to plan for your group to go to Kenya on safari. And here's the details. 14 days, and it cannot exceed $1,500 per person. And so we'd like you, again, to get together. If you need paper, let me know, and we'll give you some paper. And just write down what your plan is to get your group to Kenya to go on safari within that time frame and that amount of money per person. Let me throw a few other considerations at you. What if my idea, what if I would have added this to the specifications to the assignment? was to rough it in a 4-star luxury hotel with occasional air-conditioned trips in chauffeured limousines to see animals. Would that have changed what you had specified or undertaken at all? What if I wanted to go by cruise ship each way and only cared if I was really, quote unquote, on safari for like a day? Give me 5 days to get there, 5 days to get back. If we have 2 days there, fine, because the cruise is what I really want anyway. What if I wanted to be, the great hunter and I wanted a souvenir, which I guess in this day and age you shouldn't be doing, but if that's what I wanted, that would involve something different than the first two. What if all I wanted was what I'm hunting is with the camera. I just wanted the pictures. That's my souvenir. What if I'm the outdoor type and I wanted to be in the wilderness, miles from nowhere, in a sleep, no telephone, no anything? That certainly would be a contrast with whether I wanted to be in a 4-star hotel. Would any of these additional conditions have changed what you would have specified? Of course. Yeah. Obviously. Because, and a lot of you recognize that with, okay, you've given me a very minimum amount of information, so yes, I can do something with that minimum amount of information, but I can't really do an effective job because I can't plan for something I don't know what I'm trying to do or trying to accomplish or anything else. So that's important. And let me throw a couple other wrinkles. In one of the classes that we had when we did this back about 8 years ago, and this was ironic because in the same class among about 6 groups, we had 2 vastly different responses. The one group said, ain't no way. Can't get there for the amount of money that you had. And the bottom line is we really don't want to go there anyway. And I don't even know if this still exists, but there was Safari Land out, I think, in Largo. So what they said is, we'll go to Safari Land and we'll see animals. We'll see animals kind of like as if we were on safari, but heck, we'd have a lot more money to do other things with. So that's what they said they would do. They changed their assignment to something that fit their need. And the one I particularly liked in the same group was the next one. Here's where the group had someone from Kenya. And this guy rattled it off. He said, okay, first of all, I go home 3, 4, 5 times a year. I know exactly the right flight to go on, the cheapest flights, etc. So we don't have to do any research because this is it. And I know that we can get that flight. I know the time it takes to register, etc., etc. And he said, first of all, my friends, my relatives would be delighted to host all the group in their homes. So no one has to spend anything for hotels. No one has to spend anything for meals. We'll have the cookouts or whatever it's called. We'll take you and see all the sites. We'll take you into the outback or the bush or whatever. We'll take you to the museums. We'll take you all around Kenya to the things that we know are the most appropriate for you to see. And we'll provide the transportation. We'll provide the tour guide, etc. And what he said, and with great conviction, and everyone in that room at that time agreed after he was done, that group, under the scenario that he had described, number one, could do it. So you had the one group that said, we're going down the road to Largo and go to Safari Land. We had another one that said, yeah, we can get to Kenya for the amount of money that you said and see more and have a better time than anybody else that was planning anything else, because you had someone that knew exactly what to do and had special circumstances where he could do it. And what we want to draw the parallel here is, yes?
I think I'd do a criminal background check on him first.
A background check on the individual?
Yes.
He was a fine, upstanding state employee. He worked for the Department of Human Resources. But, and You know, I don't know if he could speak on behalf of his relatives and his friends and everything, but he convinced everyone else that he could, and it was believable. So what this intending to illustrate is a couple points. Number one, you need to know what your assignment is. You need to know what you're accomplishing, because one of the questions was, am I going for business purposes for something related to my job in the health department? Am I going for some health conference? Am I going strictly for pleasure? The on-safari is a pleasure. That makes a difference. The other thing I want to throw out is if you look at each of your groups as a competitor in a procurement, you saw there were different approaches and different answers. So the basic premise is competition is good. Having different groups work in this exercise is like having different bidders for a procurement. Within reason, and I say within reason because you can't have 1,000 bidders, but within reason, the more bidders there are, the more likely the state will end up with a good deal. And in this exercise, one group would likely be able to fully achieve the purpose of the safari within the allotted time and money due to special circumstances. And the parallel is that because of these special circumstances, the group's bid, although very low, was reasonable. One vendor said, can't do it. Another vendor said, if you equate the group to a vendor, not only can do it, but I can do it better, cheaper, and the end result will be more enjoyable for everybody. And so if there had been real bidders, the parallel here is sometimes we have the impression that a low-ball bid is always bad. And something we say in some of the other classes is not necessarily. On the one hand, you should not necessarily accept at face value what seems to be a very low bid. What you should do is check and see if there is a special circumstance like this where that bid is valid for that vendor under those circumstances. And if it is valid, award to that vendor, even if they're much lower than what you anticipated. But if you cannot identify a special circumstance like this, if instead what it seems to be is they don't know what they're getting into, or they're desperate, or they're the daredevil, etc., then you don't award to someone with an ultra-low price. But you have to know what the assignment is, you have to have the competition, you have to look at what you're getting and make a decision on actual circumstances of which is the best vendor for that circumstance and that solution. Any comments or observations on that? Anyone who, aside from what you said, yes?
We recently had to do a bid for an award that's going to be presented in December. And in the past, the former administration had always used this particular vendor, and we weren't sure why. So what I did is I did a search, and we found this vendor that was considerably cheaper.
Through a sole, how did they use the same vendor?
I'm not sure how they were. It was just every year they were using the same vendor, and it may have been sole source. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But something had changed, and now I did an internet search and found this very, very much cheaper vendor. And we thought maybe the reason they weren't using this vendor is because they couldn't do the artwork, the graphic part of it. But the vendor has assured us they can do the graphics, they can do everything. And it's like almost $300 cheaper. So of course we're going to go ahead and go with this vendor because they've been a lot cheaper than all the other vendors because it includes shipping and handling, and it includes artwork and graphics on the award. So it's interesting that sometimes administrations have been using the same vendor because they like the quality of the work of the vendor, but they may not necessarily be the best vendor.
Competition is good. So did you do a procurement to get this other vendor?
No, it's under $2,500. It's a very small.
So you did do a procurement. You did a small procurement.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I did.
You did a small procurement where for under $2,500, the basis for award is the decision of the procurement officer. So whatever led you to that decision, that is the rationale for the decision. So you stayed within the rules. Good. All right. Anybody else? Anything that you want to offer as an observation?
We had a vendor that bid the low price, and we knew he couldn't do it. And so the director turned around and said, we need to have some information on your pricing and how you put this together. And he finally bowed out and wrote a letter, withdrew his bid.
Okay, so when you had a very low
He
bid,
was planning to come in, and I'm sure he was trying to exception, and get more money
Yeah.
added to the pot.
So the bottom line is, and this is not the focus necessarily, this is more for other classes, but in your planning, some of the things you do can help skew what you get as results, and don't necessarily accept that just a low bid might be good, a low bid might be bad. You have to do some due diligence at that time. And I think we actually discussed this, if you took the Procure class, we discussed this a bit in the Procure class. Specifications can't be done in a vacuum. Would you accept that as a reasonable statement? We can't tell you what we need if you can't tell us what it is you need. Two sayings that come to mind regarding writing specifications. Live and learn. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Those are things you say all the time about writing specifications, aren't they? The lesson to be learned. Try to get as much information as feasible before writing specifications. Another one of my memorable quotes. Remember, if you don't know what you want, that's what you'll get. And that's one of the things you stop and think, what? What did you just say? If you don't know what you want, you're going to get what you don't know. Or who knows what you're going to get, I guess another way to say it. Specifications, they're hard work if done right, they're worthless if they aren't. Just as the illustration of we want 1,000 of something, 250 a time spread out over a year versus give me 1,000 at one time. Just saying the specifications to deliver 1,000 at a good price doesn't help if you can't use them and you have to incur more price to ship it somewhere else, return it, or whatever happens. So you got to do the work to get your specifications, which starts with what are you trying to solve. And risk, I said I was going to mention this probably 289 times in this class. You can count them if you want. I don't know whether this is 37 or what it is. Prudent person seeks to avoid risk, so do the state and vendors seek to avoid risk. Risk of performance. Now we're starting to go a little bit to what Gary said earlier about, well, what are we trying to achieve? And one of the things you're specifically supposed to explore is where is the risk of performance, and between you, the state, or the vendor. Typically, this is the ideal under most circumstances, and I would say under most, but not necessarily all. We want to specify the result to be achieved and make the vendor responsible for the result. Typically, we do not want to specify the means to achieve the result, how they're going to do it. Now, there's certainly exceptions to this. And actually, many times when you're dealing with services, which is what I deal with, you're going to have a combination of these aspects. You're going to be certain things that you tell them, do it this way, because you know from experience that if they don't do it that way, something is not going to be as good as if they simply follow the directions. But other parts of the specifications, you typically do not want to tell them, this is the way to do it. Tell them, this is what is supposed to happen, this is the end result, and let them tell you. And I know this is easy to say, these are what you should do. We will illustrate these concepts very concretely, I hope, as we go through this class, how we talk about versus what are called design specifications versus performance specifications. So we'll go back to the travel agent situation and kind of revisit that just from this perspective of performance versus design specifications. For validating the problem example with the travel agent, we could have told the travel agent we wanted to get a certain number of people to a specific place in Chicago by a certain date and time, which is what some of you said is the real issue or problem to be solved. We could have also specified, aside from this number of people to Chicago by this date, if there was any conditions, if we wanted to go this way or not that way, maximum time, etc. And then told the travel agent to give us the options. And instead of we telling them to buy airline tickets, you, the travel agent, we have this many people to go to Chicago by this date, come to us and give us various options for how we can get there, give us the various prices for those options, etc., and let us decide which way to go. So if we said to them, you need to get people to Chicago, and they didn't, then we wouldn't pay them, or else we would somehow assess damages against them for the lack of performance that was required. If we say buy airline tickets and they buy airline tickets, which is probably the next slide, if the only requirement was to provide airline tickets, the travel agent has no responsibility if the plane doesn't fly, other than to possibly obtain a refund. If we say buy tickets, and they bought tickets, and give them to the state employees, they've done their job. However, if you said get people to Chicago, then the job's only done if the people get to Chicago. And so that just hopefully further illustrates in a very simplistic way performance requirements. We'll keep embellishing upon that. Here we're going to go with a specific example, and this is one that shows for everything that's good, there's an element that's bad. There's always the the point counterpoint type of situation. So here's a situation that a Department of Human Resources did a true, absolute performance-based contract procurement for, I think they awarded 5 contracts for vendors to actually take individuals that were receiving welfare that did not have job skills, and they were supposed to take a couple months and give these people intensive training and then help them with job recruitment and doing interviews and various things of this nature to help these people get jobs. And the contract was structured so that they got a certain amount of money by accepting the people into this training program and having them go through the program, which might be 2 months. They got another amount of money if the person was in a job for something like 6 weeks continuously. They got more money if the person was in a job for like 6 months, and more money if they were in a job for like a year. So it was structured that the vendor only got paid for every person that completed the various stages of this whole activity, which is performance-based. If you, the vendor, don't perform, you don't get paid. If you have 100 people that come in to start the program and not one of them ends up going through the entire 2 months, the vendor gets nothing. So the risk is on the vendor to know what they're supposed to be doing, to have a program to be able to do this so that people will stay in and they can get their money. Sounds good, right? This is what I said we should be doing, performance-based contracting. All right, now let's look at what happened in this particular situation. The second bullet there, after the contract was awarded, then what DHR did not anticipate was that virtually every person that they said, you have to now go enroll in job training, filed a, I don't know what they call it, a grievance or some kind of an appeal procedure that they couldn't require the person to actually go into that job training. They had to exhaust through the Office of Administrative Hearings this appeal process. And so each of these vendors had either rented space or they had taken space in their own location. They had hired staff, they had bought supplies, they had made complete provision to get 50, 100 or so people, they specified how many they were going to serve, coming in as of the date of the contract commencement, that they were ready to receive all these people and do this good work. And it comes the date of the contract, and DHR cannot compel virtually anybody to go and start the program because they have to exhaust their administrative appeal process first, which takes as much as 3, 4, 5 months. And so you had all these vendors, these 5 vendors, bleeding money that they only got paid if they accomplished these activities, and they couldn't accomplish them because nobody was coming in the front door. And that was the obligation of DHR to provide the people and to tell the people that if you don't enroll in these programs, you will be dropped from the rolls of welfare, etc. Except they forgot that little issue of they could appeal that. And yes, they could, if the individual lost the appeal process, they could ultimately compel them, But that didn't help the vendors for the 3, 4, 5 months when no one's coming in the front door. So performance-based contract, but in the end, this particular one kind of backfired. And what happened, I guess that's what I've said. All these problems, performance areas were being achieved at lower rates than anticipated, primarily because nobody was coming in. The contractors were getting less funding than anticipated. Ordinarily, this would be a smart move for the state because virtually all the risk was on the contractor. In this case, however, all the contractors were small nonprofit organizations, including a couple of them were churches. And they were, as I said, losing money, but they weren't losing money because they were not performing. They were losing money because we can't do anything with somebody that isn't there. Some were in danger of going out of existence or defaulting on the contracts to avoid going out of business. We can't continue to lose money left and right. We're a small nonprofit. We have virtually no money to begin with. We can't pay staff if there's nothing coming in the door. So what was determined by human resource was that since this was a first attempt for this particular activity, that it didn't make sense to enforce the contract rigidly and say, nope, it doesn't matter. You don't have any people, you don't get any money. And have the vendors either default or go out of business, because the bottom line, what was trying to be achieved, let me see where I said that. What they're trying to achieve is what is on here, and I'll go back to the other ones. Without these actions, without the vendors, DHR would have had no contractors, which meant more recipients would have been staying on the welfare rolls. Thus, they would be paying more money if they had nobody to perform these activities than if they did something to try to work with the vendors and extricate them from this particular situation. Now I'm going to go back. The state did not benefit if the only vendors that were willing to undertake went out of business or were so burned they would never seek another state contract, especially when much of the problem stemmed from DHR not being able to provide the number of recipients. So what DHR was, they terminated for convenience. This is not what you would typically do in a normal situation where you have a vendor's having a problem, but in this situation, a prudent thing to do, something that we agreed with because they consulted with us at DBM, was, and I don't know whether they terminated 3 out of the 5, for convenience, which meant there was no liability to the vendor, and in fact the vendor could get what's called incurred expenses for what they had undertaken and were not going to enjoy with the termination. And then what DHR did was modify the other 2 contracts so that they would have more recipients coming in and being served, so that actually 2 were able to do as much as 5 originally had been contracted for. So that's what they did in this particular situation, which again we agreed was prudent in this situation. But what they did is, for a new activity, they took their best shot, second bullet there, at performance-based contracting. Experience showed that a combination approach, sharing the risk between vendors and the state, in this instance would work better. They adapted as best they could while the contracts were in effect, and they did something different the next time. What they did the next time was they had the vendors price at different levels of clients. So, for instance, from 1 to 50 clients, if that's what's referred to you, give me a price. For 50 to 100, give me a price. From 100 to 200, give me a price. And what that does is allow the vendor to, in each of those scenarios, make a determination of what do I need to operate to provide what is necessary if I only have that number of clients. So that it was something that shared the risk. So DHR obviously still wanted to refer as many clients as possible, but if for whatever reason fewer came in, the vendor was only getting paid, or would get paid, the rate they had quoted for the number of each of those ranges. So that's just a simple illustration of how you can take the same scenario and they still retained the performance-based aspects, that they still got money when they completed the initial training, when they completed the first placement, and after so many months on the job, etc. But they were able to quote a different price for each level of individuals that they had in service, so that they could basically take care of their fixed costs for as few as one person. And then that helped this situation in the future. Again, that's an illustration. Other things they could have done. They didn't in this situation, but they could have. Yes?
How did you determine which vendors to terminate?
How did they determine it?
Yeah. And which ones to keep on? I had thought originally just do modification to the contract for all the vendors, but
Well, that was a possibility. I mean, the first thing is you can't do a modification for something to give a vendor more than it would have gotten under the original procurement. There was no guarantee. In the specifications, there was no guarantee of any number of clients being referred to the vendor. So in that way, they gave a price without any guarantee. And so basically, even if DHR would have come to us, and maybe initially they even did come to us with a modification, I don't remember. But even if they did, we just said no. There is no changed circumstance here that would allow you to pay the vendor more money under this contract, because it was a performance-based contract where there was no guarantee of the number of individuals being assigned. So just because fewer are assigned than anticipated, hoped, whatever, there still was no violation of the contract, nothing changed in the contract, and so the vendor's not entitled to more money.
but terminating some and not others.
Well, they probably looked at who were the ones that had, I don't even know if terminating and keeping two still made those final two totally okay. But they probably looked at who was in the most desperate condition, who could handle the number of clients they're going to get best, and somehow they decided which ones to keep and which to, I don't know the details. But
They may have looked to see who would be the lowest cost determination for
and they might have done that. His point, if it's a termination for convenience, who's going to have the lowest cost to the state for the termination costs? And that might very likely have been, that certainly should have been one of the elements looked at. But that just shows you, here's an out-of-the-box solution to a problem that they could have just said, we have no responsibility, you only get paid if we give you people, and they could have let the vendors default, they could have let them go out of business, whatever, and enforced the contract. And every now and then, and I don't want to emphasize this too much because people might start doing this, but every now and then in procurement we try to do things that make sense. Now, you didn't hear it from me. Sometimes common sense does prevail, and you just have to do it the right way. We probably would not follow this answer for virtually any other procurement in the state because you wouldn't have these same circumstances. But in this situation, it made sense. The next time they did it different. They did the by intervals, got the pricing, but something else they could have done. And that would be this point here. They could have done what's called a variation in estimated quantity. They could have simply stuck the variation in estimated quantities clause into the contract and said, we estimate you will get 100 clients. And what a variation in estimated quantities clause says is that you give the estimate and you give a percentage variation from that estimate, which typical was 25% above and below the estimate. And what that means is the vendor is required to hold their price. If it was 100 people with a 25 plus or minus variation, your price is good from 75 to 125. But if the vendor got fewer than 75 or did more than 125, then the requirement would be there would be a negotiation of an equitable adjustment in the price. So all that had to happen is the contract be structured as an indefinite quantity contract with variation in estimated quantities, and they could have negotiated and given price variations if they exceeded that range. So it just illustrates there are things that you can anticipate once you know there is something that you have to address. And the best way to anticipate problems is by experiencing those problems. And once you experience them, you address them so that you hopefully don't experience them a second time. 1 time, shame on you. 2 times, shame on me. So that's, and we'll go through more of this later on, because we get in a lot of particulars when we get into particularly the 3rd, 4th, and 5th day of this class. We're still just setting up the scenario of planning.